Jim Crow laws. The dark legacy still haunting America today. What if I told you that even today, long after the abolition of Jim Crow laws, the shadow of racial inequality still lingers, affecting millions of Black Americans in ways we might not even realize? From education and housing to the criminal justice system, the effects of these infamous laws are more present than we dare to admit. In this video, we're diving deep into the haunting legacy of Jim Crow, how a set of laws designed to suppress Black Americans did more than just divide a nation but built systemic structures of inequality that still stand today. This isn't just history, it's a reality check. Hi friends, welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the untold stories and the hidden truths about history, race, and society. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and give this video a thumbs up. We're here to educate, provoke thought, and ignite conversation, and you won't want to miss out on our deep dives into critical topics like this. So, let's get into it. Let's rewind back to the late 19th century, specifically after the Reconstruction era. The Civil War had ended, the Emancipation Proclamation had freed enslaved Black Americans, but the promise of true equality remained elusive. Enter Jim Crow. What were the Jim Crow laws? Named after a racist minstrel character, Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation across the southern United States. These laws were designed to maintain white supremacy and suppress the freedoms and opportunities of Black Americans. From the late 1800s until the 1960s, Jim Crow laws dictated every aspect of life, where Black people could live, work, and even how they could interact with white people. Separate schools, water fountains, restaurants, bathrooms, everything was segregated. Separate but equal was the legal doctrine, but in reality, the facilities and opportunities offered to Black Americans were far from equal. But Jim Crow wasn't just about physical segregation, it was about reinforcing a social and economic system where Black people were kept at the bottom. The effects were catastrophic, ensuring that Black Americans had fewer opportunities for education, employment, and homeownership, creating a cycle of poverty that was nearly impossible to escape. Life under Jim Crow. Life under Jim Crow was a nightmare for Black Americans, where every aspect of life was governed by laws that degraded and dehumanized. From the late 1800s through the mid-1960s, Jim Crow laws systematically segregated Black people from white society, reinforcing a brutal racial hierarchy. Public facilities were divided into white and colored spaces, schools, restaurants, trains, buses, even drinking fountains and restrooms. But the doctrine of separate but equal was a blatant lie. In reality, the facilities and services available to Black Americans were woefully inadequate. Schools for Black children were severely underfunded, often lacking basic supplies, while white schools flourished with better teachers, books, and infrastructure. But Jim Crow wasn't just about denying access to resources. It was about reinforcing a social order where Black people were reminded of their place every single day. In many southern towns, Black people couldn't even make eye contact with white people or speak to them unless spoken to first, under the threat of violence. For a Black person to challenge this status quo, whether by trying to vote, assert their rights, or seek better opportunities, was to risk their life. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups acted as enforcers of Jim Crow, terrorizing Black communities through lynchings, arson, and other forms of brutal violence. This wasn't just a set of laws, it was an entire system designed to crush the spirit and opportunities of Black Americans, keeping them in a state of fear and poverty. Housing was no different. Black families were confined to segregated neighborhoods that lacked basic amenities and were often located in the most polluted or flood-prone areas. Banks refused to lend to Black people, and when they did, it was at exploitative rates, making it nearly impossible for them to build wealth through homeownership, the very foundation of middle-class life in America. Meanwhile, job opportunities were limited to low-paying, often dangerous manual labor roles. Skilled or higher-paying jobs were almost exclusively reserved for whites, and the wage gap between Black and white workers was staggering. Black Americans were forced into a cycle of poverty that was almost impossible to break. The psychological toll of living under Jim Crow was immense. Black Americans were constantly reminded that they were less than human in the eyes of the law. The very act of existing under this system was a daily struggle for dignity and survival. Families were torn apart, communities terrorized, and generations of Black Americans were denied the basic human rights that should be afforded to everyone. The scars of Jim Crow aren't just historical footnotes. They are deeply embedded in the collective memory of Black America, and they continue to impact how Black people experience this country today. The lingering legacy. While the civil rights movement of the 1960s dismantled the legal framework of Jim Crow, its shadow still looms over American society today. The laws may be gone, but the structures of inequality they built are still standing. One of the most obvious remnants is the American criminal justice system. Black Americans are disproportionately affected by policies that can be traced back to the era of racial segregation. Take mass incarceration, for example. Today, Black men are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than white men. This isn't just a coincidence, it's the result of decades of discriminatory laws and policies that have targeted Black communities under the guise of law and order. The war on drugs in the 1980s, for instance, disproportionately criminalized Black Americans for offenses that white Americans were either not prosecuted for or faced lighter sentences. The prison industrial complex became the new plantation, trapping millions of Black men in a cycle of incarceration, poverty, and disenfranchisement. Education, too, remains a battleground. Although Brown v. Board of Education officially ended school segregation in 1954, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Many schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods remain underfunded, overcrowded, and lacking in basic resources. Black students are more likely to attend schools where the majority of their classmates are low income, and this has far-reaching consequences. With fewer resources, these students are often left behind in terms of academic achievement, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and limited opportunity. The inequality is so stark that it raises the question: was segregation ever truly dismantled, or has it merely evolved into a more subtle, insidious form? Housing discrimination is another area where the legacy of Jim Crow is still felt. The practice of redlining, where banks would literally draw red lines around Black neighborhoods and deny residents loans or mortgages, might be illegal today, but its effects are still evident. Generations of Black families were denied the opportunity to build wealth through homeownership, and as a result, the racial wealth gap in America is as wide as ever. Today, the average Black family holds only a fraction of the wealth of the average white family. This disparity affects everything from education to healthcare to retirement, making it harder for Black Americans to climb the economic ladder. Perhaps the most controversial continuation of Jim Crow is in the realm of voting rights. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was supposed to guarantee that Black Americans could exercise their right to vote without facing barriers like literacy tests and poll taxes. But in recent years, there has been a resurgence of voter suppression tactics, particularly in states with large Black populations. Strict voter ID laws, reduced polling places in Black neighborhoods, and purging of voter rolls are just some of the methods being used to suppress the Black vote. These tactics might be more covert than those used during the Jim Crow era, but their intent is the same: to silence the political power of Black Americans. And then there's the psychological impact. The trauma of living under Jim Crow didn't just disappear when the laws were repealed. Generations of Black Americans have grown up in a country that told them they were second-class citizens, and this message has left deep emotional scars. The feeling of being less than has been passed down through generations, contributing to higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression in Black communities. The mental health impacts of systemic racism are only now beginning to be fully understood, and they are just as damaging as the physical and economic tolls. In many ways, Jim Crow never truly died, it simply evolved. The laws may be gone, but the attitudes and structures that supported them remain deeply entrenched in American society. From mass incarceration to voter suppression, from educational inequality to the racial wealth gap, the legacy of Jim Crow continues to haunt Black Americans to this day. The fight for racial equality is far from over, and until these lingering effects are fully addressed, the promise of true freedom and justice for all remains unfulfilled. Jim Crow, as a set of laws, may have been dismantled, but Jim Crow as an idea never really went away. Racism in America didn't disappear, it just evolved. Today, The systems of inequality are less overt but just as insidious. From mass incarceration to voter suppression, the ghosts of Jim Crow still haunt the institutions that govern our lives. So, what does this mean for us? It means we have a responsibility to recognize these lingering effects and work toward dismantling them. The fight for racial equality didn't end with the civil rights movement, it continues today. Now that we've peeled back the layers of Jim Crow and its lasting impact, it's up to us to keep this conversation going. The fight for justice and equality is far from over, and your voice matters. If this video made you think, if it opened your eyes to something new, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your friends and family, because the more people understand the legacy of Jim Crow, the better we can work together to dismantle the systems that still uphold racial inequality. And don't forget to leave a comment below with your thoughts. How do you think we can address these lingering effects today? Let's start a conversation. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay committed to justice.